I wrote the first version of this book back in 2016, 2017, which was in response to the events of 2 years earlier, 2014, when Vladimir Putin seized Crimea, and where the sort of Russian forces effectively fomented a civil war in the east of Ukraine, the sort of the Donbass. And I decided to write it then because a lot of people, I think, were completely taken by surprise by what happened in 2014. They hadn't really been paying much attention to what was happening in that part of the world. And sort of the thesis of the book, as I first wrote it, was actually, this has been a long time coming. We've really got to go back to 1991 and the end of the Soviet Union, the end of communism, the end of the Cold War, to see essentially what went wrong, why we went from the euphoria, the sort of this end of history, as people were calling it, period of the early 1990s, to the war of 2014. And then when, obviously in February, we had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, almost a kind of part two of what had happened in 2014, I thought, well, it's worth going back to it and actually filling in what has happened since 2014, right up to the invasion and beyond, to look at, how the situation has developed. And, in a sense, I found that I was quite pleased to see that my original thesis, which is of, essentially mistakes and misunderstandings on both sides, had held up quite well, tragically well, and had, turned into the conflagration that we have at the moment.
I mean, you say in your book, the year 2022 will go down in history as a turning point, the end of complacency and overconfidence among the Western powers that kicked off as the Berlin Wall fell. Our times are now more volatile than anyone could have imagined in 1991. The key to this is Putin's attack on Ukraine did not come out of the blue. I mean, many people know that, of course, and you've mentioned Crimea in 2014, but what were the other telling signs that perhaps, went unnoticed, or the most important other ones, would you say?
I mean, I think what we've got, if one looks at the period since 1991, is that one had this chaotic 1990s when Russia was making a very dramatic transition from communism to capitalism, presided over by Boris Yeltsin, this half-drunk, fairly crazy, chaotic kind of figure. That kind of came to an end from 2000. We have Putin from 2000, who started off essentially quite friendly towards the West. He was sympathetic towards George Bush after 9/11. At one point, he even talked about wanting to join NATO, extraordinarily as it might seem now. And we had essentially a gradual disintegration. One can point to all sorts of things on both sides. Maybe the Iraq War really poisoned relations between Russia and America, and we see more generally, I think, a kind of a Russian feeling as Russia got stronger again, that it was being taken for granted by the West, that it was not being treated with the kind of respect that it should be shown by the West, coupled with a man in the form of Vladimir Putin, who initially, I mean, one forgets it now, but one looks at kind of photographs from the period from the early 2000s, he was a sort of a shy, diffident kind of figure who gradually, in the course of the 22 years he's been in power, has gradually built up his own influence, increasingly turned Russia into a repressive country, almost as repressive as it had been in the Soviet Union, and who's been flexing his muscles, leading to the events of 2014, and then this sort of second greater intensification now.
He's been flexing his muscles, and of course, you say there's a lot that sort of people haven't stopped in his path, I suppose, that they could have, that Western powers could have. But Putin is an enigma, isn't he? I mean, it's so difficult to find out, for anyone to work out what he's thinking, what he's planning. And he's just built up such an air of mystery and around him, hasn't he? People just can't get to the man and understand his plans.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, I mean, one sees, my book is not going to be sitting alone in the bookshops, to be surrounded by a variety of books about Vladimir Putin, biographies of him, what's going on in Putin's mind, all this kind of stuff. I'm a little skeptical of not just because they're rival books, obviously. I'm a little skeptical of these other works because, I think there are two lots of people. There are those people who know, a small number of people who know what's really going on with Putin and what he's really planning, who don't say anything, and those people who don't know what's really going on and who say a lot. He has a very, very narrow circle of advisors, and I think that circle has become a lot narrower since COVID. One of the sort of the odder things I think is the effect that the pandemic appears to have had on him. Lockdown made us all go a little bit crazy, but I think possibly in Putin's case it was an even more extreme version of that, because he locked himself away literally from everyone else. Anyone who wanted to go and see him had to quarantine, and those who did see him was a very, very small number of very, very hardline figures. And I think that's also appears to have played a part. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, on the record has spoken about sort of the change that he detected. And he's someone who had spent quite a lot of time talking on the phone to Putin. And he sort of saw him as kind of a different figure after COVID than he was before COVID. This is obviously, it's not COVID alone hasn't done this. This is more a gradual process that has been going on for years. But I think it may have also played a part.
Can I ask you? Well, actually, you mention Emmanuel Macron. You say that he really did sort of set out to woo Russia when he first came to power in France. You talk about things that Angela Merkel's Germany did with regards to Russia. Do you see those as the worst culprits in the terms of who lost Russia, if that's the question?
Yes, I suppose maybe a word of explanation that the who lost Russia is a sort of a play on an expression that was current in America after China went communist, which was sort of who lost China, i.e. what did we do wrong such that this country turned into our enemy. So look at Macron and Angela Merkel. I mean, they both pursued, I think, different strategies. Merkel's, I think, is more flawed because Merkel's essentially was the idea that if you trade enough with a country, you're not going to become an enemy of that country. So she essentially was happy for Germany to become increasingly dependent on Russian energy exports. This was not only because it provided Germany with a good source of cheap energy, but also sort of a way of kind of binding Russia into the broader sort of European economic situation. And by the other side of the coin, it had allowed Germany to sell a lot of its cars and other kind of products to Russia, which is a similar policy which Germany also has pursued towards China. Now, that policy, I think, has been exposed as being deeply flawed, as one's seen since the invasion. Germany is rapidly trying to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. The French, I think, pursued a slightly different line under Macron, and that was, and I think there was quite a lot of sense to it, that they were saying, essentially, we cannot ignore Russia. Russia is there. Russia is an enormous country. It's a huge military force, maybe not as much of a force as we've seen it in action as people presumed, yet it's still undoubtedly a big nuclear power. And we can't ignore it. We have to find some way of integrating it into a kind of European security situation. So we don't just end up with an Iron Curtain as we had before, but with this Iron Curtain just a few hundred miles to the east. Now, Macron very, very clearly didn't succeed with that. But, I think another point one could make is that when this war does finally end, which, by definition, it must end, probably won't end very soon, but it will eventually have to end. How do we then relate to Russia? Do we treat it as a pariah? Do we just put a wall around it and treat it like an enormous North Korea? Or do we find some way of engaging with it? And, how we do that, of course, will depend on who is sitting in the Kremlin, whether it's still Putin, whether it's perfectly conceivably someone even more hardline and unpleasant as far as we're concerned, or, this one tiny glimmer of hope that there may be some kind of pro-Western reforming figure, which I fear is really very, very tiny glimmer.
I feel I need to ask, given this title that you've explained, who lost Russia? Lost feels like a very final sort of a word. You've just been touching upon it there, but do you conclude that Russia is lost?
For the moment, the title, the book had this title already when it came out in the first version in 2017, and I think it was, it's even more lost now than it was then. I don't know. Everything depends really on how this war ends, and only then will we be able to look to the future. But for the time being, it's just grinding on and on. As you mentioned in your introduction, we've just seen the 6-month anniversary of it, and I fear that it will probably still be going on another 6 months from now.